So one thing that comes to mind for me when I think about quality versus quantity is coffee. So there was a time where I said, I'm going to get good quality coffee. Now, I don't know if you've gotten good quality coffee before, but it isn't cheap. And I'm not talking about the good quality coffee that you might think about at Kroger, not Starbucks or Dunkin'. Hate to break it to you, but that's actually not as good a quality as they want you to think. The kind of quality I'm talking about is the quality coffee you can't even get at Kroger. You have to go to like a coffee shop that sells these types of beans. So for a while I was getting, it's called Utopia coffee. So there's this, it's a roaster in Fort Wayne called Utopia, and they have very good quality coffee. It's not very cheap. And so I was getting this for a while from Shaka Shack. You can get it from the coffee shop there in Monroe, or you could at least this time. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna get good quality coffee, so that means I'm only gonna drink a couple of cups a day. So if everyone knows me, normally I carry around this big old 30-ounce Yeti mug. Now, if I wanted to fill that with good quality coffee, it was gonna be probably like $60 worth of coffee a month. And that's only for one a day. And so that's not happening. And so I said, okay, I will just drink less. This is a good lesson. So for a while, I was just drinking, I think I was making like 3 cups versus 10 cups a day. And that was just enough to have, not quite even, just one like smaller mug size. So I was doing that, and then eventually I'm like, you know what? I miss being able to just get out my Folgers and make a pot anytime I want. And so I decided to go back to Folgers. And so I just drink cheap coffee at home for more quantity. But when I want some quality coffee, I can go to the Shaka Shack in Monroe, and they have really good coffee there. So that's where I get my quantity over quality. Now, some ways that I will never, go for quantity is I have to have name brand pop. I'm sorry, I don't like to get the off-brand. And same for cereal. Both of those, you want the name brand. But if we're honest, both of those cases, the quality is exactly the same. It's just you pay for the name. So it's not quite the same. But I will always get Coke or Pepsi and Captain Crunch, not the Kroger brand, whatever the Kroger brand's called. No judgment on people who get that. It is cheaper. But for me, that's a place I want to go. In life, we always have to either pick quality or quantity. You can't usually get both, unfortunately. And that's also true in relationships. If we want to have a lot of quality relationships, it's not possible. Because relationships require time and effort. And there's been research that really suggests that humans can't have an infinite number of very deep quality relationships. We can only have about 4 or 5 really deep relationships. Now we can have more of what we would call less deep relationships, but you have to pick one or the other. You can't know every person as deeply as you would like, and that's probably a good thing. But when it comes to relationships, we can have lots of connections. But the question is, do we have at least some quality relationships? Because research also suggests that in today's world, humans, specifically adults, have less quality relationships than people in past generations. But when we look at Paul and Timothy, as we look at the end of this letter from Colossians, what we're going to see is that Paul, he knew a lot of people. He had to have, because he traveled all over the ancient world from city to city. And it seems like every place he went, he met people. But when he met those people, he was going for quality relationships. He was going to get to know people. Because Paul was doing kingdom work, and he knew that we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. That's what Paul knew. He says he knew that we could not and we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. And so everywhere Paul went, he was looking to develop kingdom relationships. And we see evidence of this in this final section of Colossians. So if you want to open up to Colossians 4, 7 through 18, we're going to be looking at the last couple of verses of this book today. 4, 7 through 18, which if you want to follow along on the Pew Bible is page 1680. It will be up here on the screen as well. 1680, the last bit of Colossians, starting in chapter 4, verse 7, and to the end of the book, which is verse 18. So let's take a look at this final section together. This is how it starts. Colossians 4:7 and 8. Antiochus will tell you all the news about me. He is a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. I am sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. All right, last week, if you were here, we saw this little section where Paul talked about praying for their work and praying for the spread of the story of Jesus. And now Paul and Timothy have this final section where they're concluding their final remarks to the Colossians. And so the first thing that they say is, this guy named Antiochus, he's going to tell you the news about me. Now, Paul and Timothy are sending this letter, and part of them sending the letter is to give information about their circumstances. So the big question is, well, what is the circumstances of Colossians? We don't know a lot, but we know this, that Paul has been arrested. It doesn't say it in this section, but in the section before, Paul mentions being imprisoned. And here in a minute, he's going to talk about somebody who's imprisoned with him. So he's in prison. Now the question is, where is he in prison at? If you've read the book of Acts, he gets arrested in Jerusalem, and when he's in Jerusalem, eventually he gets sent to Rome. So the book of Acts follows Paul's imprisonment in Jerusalem, and then he goes to this city called Caesarea Antioch. I think that's what it is. There's this other city in the Judean area that he moves to because it's safer for him. It wasn't safe in Jerusalem, so they moved him. And eventually he goes to Rome. And on the way to Rome, there's this shipwreck that happens and all these things, but he eventually gets to Rome. And the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome. So the standard tradition is that Paul is writing Colossians from Rome, and that he sends the letter to Colossae from Rome. And this guy named Antiochus is going to come, and he's going to tell the Colossians Paul's situation. We would easily could ask, well, why doesn't Paul just write about his situation? A couple of reasons why. Number one, writing letters was expensive, so they probably didn't want to put that part in the letter. Paul had specific things he wanted to say, and he says, the rest I can send with Antiochus. Antiochus will tell you what's going on. Or he doesn't want to put in writing what's going on because there's not an official postal service. There's no guarantee this letter will get to its destination safely. Maybe Paul doesn't want to put in writing what's going on to protect himself. Not sure what it is, but all we can know is if we could talk to Antiochus, we would know what happened. So who is this Antiochus figure? We don't know a lot about him. What we do know is that Antiochus was the letter carrier of the book of Ephesians, that letter. In Ephesians 6:21 through 22, Antiochus is the one who carried that letter. Now, Paul mentions a man named Epaphras here in the first part of this book. He's going to mention him here in a minute. We think Epaphras is actually the letter carrier of this book, of this letter. But Antiochus is an important person for Paul as well. If Paul is going to trust Antiochus to carry a letter, he trusts him because letter carriers in the first century didn't just deliver the letter. They also knew about it. They were prepared to read it and then answer questions to the audience. So maybe the letter would be read and the people would ask, well, what did Paul mean by this and that? And then Antiochus was supposed to be able to speak on Paul's behalf to the people. So he had an important role. So this was a quality relationship that Paul had with Antiochus. We can't live the Jesus way without kingdom relationships. Like I said, Paul was always looking for kingdom relationships. And he had this man named Antiochus, who he trusted so much that he sent this letter and he says, you're going to deliver to these Christians the message about what's going on with me. Relationships are important in the work of the kingdom. Now let's see what Paul says next here in verse 9. He is coming, so Antiochus is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. So now Paul mentions another man named Onesimus. Now I've mentioned Onesimus a couple of weeks ago. Onesimus was from Colossae, and he was an escaped slave. And we know this because he's mentioned in the little tiny book of Philemon. The little book of Philemon is written to the owner of Onesimus. Now, where did Paul meet Onesimus? That's the question. Because Onesimus went to find Paul, or they encountered each other. And then Onesimus became a Christian, and he grew in faith. And then Paul's like, okay, I'm going to send you back to your owner. Now, the tradition, like I said, the traditional view is that Paul met Onesimus in Rome, because that's where Paul was imprisoned. But the other perspective is that Paul was in the city of Ephesus. Now, Ephesus is a lot closer to Colossae than Rome. In the book of Acts, there's a riot in Ephesus, and Paul is questioned by the authorities there, but there's never mention of him being arrested. So that's why some scholars don't think this is what happened. But the evidence really, I think, suggests that Paul was actually in Ephesus. He was arrested and he was in prison there. And while he was in Ephesus, which is not far at all from these other cities, the message went out, and then Paul sent some letters to the little cities north of Ephesus, about, I think it's maybe 50 miles. And he was hoping to come visit them, and he met this man named Onesimus, who was an escaped slave. He said, I want you to go back to Philemon. And he says to Philemon, wink, wink, I want you to free Onesimus and send him back to me. So these are all people Paul has met, and Paul is sending, and he's trusting with his work. It didn't matter to Paul who Onesimus was. He was now a kingdom partner. And so Paul trusted Onesimus, and then Paul wanted Onesimus to come back and work with him. We can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. Do we see people around us? Do we see them as partners in the work of the kingdom? Do we meet people and hope that they might come to know Jesus and join our work? Because that's what Paul did. He met Onesimus. He taught Onesimus. And then he empowered him to do kingdom work. For Paul, relationships always mattered, and he always invested in them. The question we need to ask ourselves is, do relationships matter to us? Do we invest in them like Paul did? Relationships were central to what Paul did. And we see this as we continue here in verse 10. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. So now Paul mentions this man named Aristarchus, and he says he's my fellow prisoner. Now, who is Aristarchus? Aristarchus is mentioned in Acts as one of Paul's travelers. Also, Aristarchus is in Ephesus in Acts, and he gets taken before the magistrate in that city. So this is another reason why scholars have said, we think Paul was actually imprisoned in Ephesus. Because Aristarchus seems to be in prison with him right now, and it would make sense that the two of them got arrested after that riot, and they're in prison. Aristarchus knows the Colossians, and Paul sends his greetings. Because this is what Paul would do. He had all these people he would work with, and then at the end of the letters, they would be sending their greetings and love. Also, we have this man named Mark. Mark is another person mentioned in Acts. Now, Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. Barnabas and Paul go on their first missionary journey together in Acts. And Mark goes with them. And while Mark is on this journey, he, for whatever reasons, decides to leave early. And he leaves Paul and Barnabas and basically abandons them. And now it's time for the second journey. Barnabas and Paul are like, okay, we're going to go and we're going to see some of these same cities again, and we're going to also go to some new places. Barnabas says, I want to take Mark. And Paul says, I'm not taking Mark. And so they end up deciding to go their separate ways. Barnabas and Mark go one way, Paul goes another. Well, here, it seems as if Paul is made up, because he says, you have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. As in Paul says, hey, look, you might have heard about Mark and I's feud. He's like, but if he comes to you, I want you to receive him. Because we've made up. Because Paul, he wants to have kingdom relationships. And even whenever there's division, he wants to find reconciliation. And so Paul has reconciled with Mark. And then he also mentions this Jesus who's called Justus. And all we know about Justus is that he is one of these fellow Jews working with Paul. So Paul has these three guys who he's working with, who are there with him. Now, I really want to think about Mark for a minute. How often do we have falling outs with people? It happens. Paul even had that happen. But he was willing to try to reconcile. Not that it always worked. It takes people to go two ways. But Paul was willing to do it. We can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. Everywhere Paul went, he built kingdom relationships. And he was even willing to reconcile them. I would say that Paul was probably wrong about John Mark. That's why he later decided to reconcile. And then, we have a book in the New Testament that we read today, right, called Mark. We don't know for sure, but scholars are pretty confident to say that Mark is probably, this Mark here is the author of that book. So Mark had a relationship with Paul and with Peter, and we think from them he gathered the story of Jesus and wrote it in what is now called the Gospel of Mark. Because Paul was willing to give Mark a second chance. Because Paul was about building kingdom relationships, and we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. Verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. So now we have some more. This first guy, Epaphras, is mentioned in the first chapter of Colossians. He is the letter carrier, and Paul says, I commend him to you. Now, we think that Epaphras was the one who brought the message to Colossae and then also to these other churches, Laodicea and Hierapolis. These are three cities very close together. And so Paul is sending this letter to all of these cities. Now Epaphras goes, and then another man by the name of Luke. We have another gospel by the name of Luke, right? It's the one we're going to start reading next year in the lectionary. We're not sure, but again, scholars have tried to piece this together, and Luke, they think, is the author of Luke in the book of Acts. And this Luke is with Paul. And then there's this other man named Demas, and we don't know much about him other than that he was one of Paul's co-workers. All of these men are Gentiles, they're non-Jews, and they're also working with Paul. Paul worked with fellow Jews and with Gentiles. It didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was building relationships that mattered for the kingdom. And so he did. We can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. We often think about Paul as this lone ranger out in the wild west of the Roman Empire spreading the gospel. That wasn't the way it was. He always had a close group of people with him wherever he went. In every city he went to, he developed relationships. He empowered people. He taught them. And then he left them. But he continued to have that relationship. He worked through kingdom relationships in his individual ministry. But he also expected the churches that he started to have relationships as well. Look here. Starting with verse 15. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha in the church in her house. After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. Tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. So this is written to the church of Colossae, I said. And like I said, there's these other churches right next door. And one of them is in the city of Laodicea. Now, Paul wrote a letter to Laodicea as well. We don't have that letter. Unless, and this is one final note I'll give you about what's going on. Scholars do think that maybe Ephesians was actually written to Laodicea. Now, the reason they think this is because in the first little bit of Ephesians, it says to the church in Ephesus, But we have a lot of manuscripts that actually don't have in Ephesus. And so it could have been that this letter was written to Laodicea. It was later written from Ephesus, because we think Paul, if he was in prison in Ephesus, he wrote this letter, sent it to these little churches, and then each letter carrier had one. And then they were supposed to switch. And Ephesians is very similar to Colossians in a lot of ways. And that would make sense if Paul wrote them at around the same time to similar situations and switched them. But we don't know. We don't. That letter could have been lost to us. But Paul wanted these churches to share information, and he saw them as partners in ministry together. And he saw the churches as working together and sharing what they had in the work of the kingdom. These were sister churches, and Paul wanted them to see one another as sisters, working together in their cities to bring the kingdom message to their people. One of the greatest tragedies of our time is that rather than churches seeing each other as partners, working together, we split and fracture and divide. You know, the rumor is that the road out here used to be called Church Road. You know, some of you maybe remember that. There was 4 churches on our road, now there's 3. And the 2 churches each direction from us, our founders share heritage with, as you might know. Our founders attended not either of these Lutheran churches because we are older than them, but one of the, Friedheim Lutheran over here, Zion Friedheim, I think is what it's called, right, technically. Our founders came from that congregation. And it says that they long for the Reformed faith rather than the Lutheran faith. Now, that was a different time, but it is heartbreaking to me that we're so fractured, even in today's world. When what Paul and Timothy envisioned was these churches working together in kingdom relationships. Now, it takes both ways. I know that we would be more than happy to partner with any of our Lutheran brothers and sisters in any way they wanted. But I also know that that's not the Missouri-centered doctrine, for better or for worse. But we are standing here with arms open wide. We can't live the Jesus way without kingdom relationships. Paul and Timothy envisioned their churches working together, sharing resources, sharing leaders, sharing what they'd learned, sharing how to learn to live the way of Jesus together. That's what we can do. So we can build kingdom relationships with other churches. We've done that some. There's other ways we're trying to do it more. We are part of the EA, Evangelical Association. And there's been ways in the future we hope to partner with churches to share what we have, to share work in the kingdom. And what I do encourage is for all of you to see fellow brothers and sisters at other congregations as people we can partner with, even if it's just an individual basis and not between congregations or denominations. So as this letter comes to a close, we can't miss that for Paul and Timothy, all of the work they did in Colossians could only be done through kingdom relationships. This is one of those churches that Paul didn't even start. Somebody that he met and trained and taught went and started these churches through kingdom relationships. And then Paul had relationships with them. He didn't work alone, and we can't work alone. Every relationship is an opportunity to build the kingdom. So the question I want to ask you is, do you see relationships in this way? Because we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. So I think there's a couple of different relationships that we can build. One of them would be a relationship of encouragement. Living the way of Jesus is hard, but it's easier when we do it with other people. We need kingdom relationships that center around encouragement. Friends and family members, acquaintances, whatever it is, but we come together, and it's part of what we do here, coming together to encourage one another to remain faithful, to live the way of Jesus. Because we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. A second is relationships of growth. On the way of Jesus, we should be growing. Some of these relationships might be about growth. Maybe we are in a relationship where we're helping somebody else grow. Maybe we are following somebody that's helping us. We follow somebody and we grow. We lead somebody and they grow. It's two-way street. We can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships. And then the final type of relationship, this is just 3, there could be infinite number probably, is relationships for ministry. And these relationships are ways that we can do ministry together and see the kingdom spread. Sometimes a relationship might cover 1, 2, or all 3 of these categories. I don't want to limit it, but we might have relationships with people where we partner and we do something with them once a week or once a month. Even what we do with Growing Hope once a year. That is a kingdom relationship that's about ministry. We empower Growing Hope globally to do the work they do around the world. That's a kingdom relationship. You might have some in your life that you do, that you have. There also might be a relationship that has both growth and encouragement in ministry. What I want us to think about is how are the relationships in our lives helping us grow, follow Jesus, and do the work of the kingdom. Because what Paul and Timothy knew is that we can't live the Jesus way, we can't live the way of Jesus without kingdom relationships.